Good morning, everyone. I'm Russ Cohen, and here we are along the glorious Riverwalk footpath along the Housatonic River in the scenic town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts in the Berkshires. And we're here this morning to look at the edible wild plants that are growing along Riverwalk. And this is a great place to see and learn about edible wild plants. It's not a great place to actually pick and harvest them, but it's a great place to learn about them. And you'll see some familiar plants that you'll know from your own neighborhoods, perhaps growing in your own property where it would, of course, be okay to harvest and eat them. But this is a good spot to learn about them and observe them, and then to generally leave them in place for others to enjoy, although occasionally there will be things like butternuts along the trail that would be okay to harvest. But mostly we're looking at plants here and not harvesting them. All right, here along Riverwalk, we've got a nice specimen of a hazelnut bush. And there are two species of hazelnuts that are native to New England. There's the common hazelnut and the beaked hazelnut. And the only real difference between them is the appearance of the husks surrounding the nuts. The common hazelnut, the husk is going to be about 1.5 inches in diameter, and it will look like a little head of cabbage. And then the nut ripens inside that. If it were the beaked hazelnut, the nut is in a little spherical green furry ball about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with a strange green thing sticking out of it about 2 inches long that looks like a bird's beak. But the nut inside is the same, and I don't think the flavor varies between the common hazelnut and the beaked hazelnut. So you'll see here there's multiple stems coming up in the same location. That's very typical for the way this plant grows. And they tend to be sort of a shrubby tree. They never get more than about 15 feet tall. And so one spot I often encounter hazelnuts is underneath telephone lines or power lines. And I think they benefit from all the sun they get there. And in general, the telephone companies and the power companies tolerate the presence of the hazelnuts because they know that the trees will never get tall enough to short out the wires. And so where the hazelnuts grow in these thickets, these dense clumps of plants, they tend to inhibit the growth of the taller trees that could short out the wires. So hazelnuts are fun in the spring, in the early spring, because they're one of our earliest blooming plants. So way before there are any leaves, there are the male flowers called catkins, and here you can see an old remainder of a catkin from last year that just didn't form well this year. But the ones that did form this year would have elongated and been about 2 inches long, shedding pollen. And then near those catkins on the same plant are these gorgeous little ruby red female flowers. And so the wind carries the pollen from the male catkins to the female flowers, and then that's where the nuts form on the plants. So I was checking this common hazelnut to see if I could find any developing nuts on here, and I can't see any. And it might be that this particular bush is going to have an off year and just not produce well. But it is sort of early in the season. So ordinarily I'm not looking for the developing husks on the plant until well into the summer. And the nuts are going to be ripe toward the end of the summer. So usually first couple weeks of September is when I'm gathering them. And so you'll see on this common hazelnut that green, about 1 inch in diameter, green husk that looks like a little head of cabbage that surrounds the nut. And as it ripens, the two halves of the husk open up, and then inside you see, the familiar hazelnut nut. And eventually, when it's fully ripe, either the whole husk falls off the ground or the nut falls out of the husk on the ground. So if you want to gather hazelnuts, do not wait though until that happens, because if you do, you will never get any nuts yourself. The squirrels and chipmunks will get all of them before you do. So what you need to do is time your visit to the hazelnut tree so that the nuts are still attached to the tree in their husks and haven't fallen off yet, but are as close to ripe as possible. And that's usually the first or second week of September. So that's when I would check them. And the husk usually would begin to turn a little golden or a little brown just before it falls off. And that's when to gather them. And And I would be misleading you if I said to you, you haven't lived to try the flavor of a wild hazelnut, because it's more or less the same flavor as a cultivated hazelnut. And our wild nuts are smaller in size than domesticated filberts that you could buy at the store. And so you might say, I'll just go to the store and buy hazelnuts, which is fine, but I want to just tell you and reassure you that I have certainly in Massachusetts found places where I've gathered hundreds and hundreds of hazelnuts. So it is possible to do that if you want to. This appears to be some developing hazelnuts inside the fertilized female flowers. So by early September, first couple weeks of September, these will have expanded to over an inch in size with a nut inside. So that's what I would look for later in the season. And then also on this one, we'll talk a little bit more about the double tooth thing I was describing. So here on the leaf, you see the larger teeth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all the little serrations between it. That's what's known as double tooth. That's a way to help distinguish the hazelnut plant from other things. A lookalike, which is witch hazel, which isn't edible, it's a medicinal plant, where the lobes are much rounder. So if you're seeing this double toothed action, that is one of the distinguishing features of a hazelnut bush. All right, so that's hazelnut. Let's see what else we can find here. All right, here along Riverwalk, we've got two great examples of a native tree called a basswood. So the botanical name for this one is Tilia americana. And you may also, depending upon where you're from, you may more readily encounter another species called Tilia cordata, which is the little leaf linden, which is deployed a lot as a street tree in cities. I'm happy to tell you from a foraging perspective, the species are the same. In fact, all species of Tilia can be treated the same way. And the two edible parts on the basswood tree, or linden tree if you prefer, are the young leaves and the flowers. So on this sapling here, we've got some leaves, and these are probably just maybe a few days beyond the ideal stage to eat them. But I would harvest, especially if I've been here several days ago, I would have harvested this young leaf and just eaten it right on the spot if you want to. It's a mild flavor and slightly mucilaginous, and it's fine to eat it just plain right off the tree, or you can put it into salads, or in England, the linden trees are called lime trees in England, and they'll make these lime tree sandwiches, which are like the watercress sandwiches on the white bread with the crust cut off, and they will just layer the young linden leaves as the filling for the sandwich. All right, so that's the first stage, and before I go on and talk about the flowers, let me just point out very helpful distinguishing characteristic to look for to know the plants in the Tilia genus. You see how asymmetrical the leaf is. So I look for that. And that's very useful. And then if we come over to this other basswood, this has the other part on the plant that is very helpful to distinguish it. And if you look on the plant right here, you can see the flowers getting ready to bloom. And then there's this structure right here. Let me just break one off. All right, so the second part on a basswood or linden tree that you can eat are the flowers. You actually make a drink from the flowers. And here we have the flower bud showing up. And this thing right here is called a bract. And that has a function that will happen when the flowers bloom and turn into little nutlets. And in the fall, this whole thing breaks off, and then it does this like a helicopter as it's falling toward the ground. And the trick is that that slows the rate that the seeds fall on the ground and gives the chance for the wind to blow it further away, so that the tree will help to spread itself further away than if the nutlets just all went clunk right underneath the tree. Okay, so here there's going to be soon the flowers blooming at the end of this little stem right here, and the flowers will have a yellowish green color, and they'll be very fragrant and have a very nice lemon honey type smell. And that's what you make the tea from. You just steep the flowers in hot water for a few minutes, and you have a delightfully flavored tea that also has 2 medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So it's a very highly regarded tea by herbalists in Europe and in the United States. Let me just add one thing about the ecological value of this plant. When people become aware of the need for us to care about pollinators and to plant pollinator gardens and stuff like that, and that of course is very important, they tend to be thinking about the herbaceous plants as the pollinator plants. Well, we have trees that are pollinator plants too, and the basswood would fall into that category, because when these flowers are blooming, and it won't just be the flowers within humans' reach standing on the ground, these trees get to be 40, 50, 60 feet tall, and they're blooming from top to bottom. And so the pollinators can be flying into the upper branches, so the pollinators can visit all the flowers they need, even if you're harvesting some from ground level to make the tea. But when the plant is blooming, you can hear the tree before you see it because of the buzzing of all the insects visiting the flowers at that time. And let me just add finally that I'm not surprised that we're finding the basswood along the river here, because it is a species that I often see in and along rivers. All right, let's move to the next one. All right, here along Riverwalk in Great Barrington, we've got an excellent example of a elderberry bush. And let me just say, this is the common elderberry. Here in the Berkshires, we also have the red-berried elder. And the red-berried elder has a pyramidical shaped flower cluster and a cluster of red berries that come out in the summer. That is not edible. This is the edible one. This is called the common or the black-berried elder. Sambuca nigra or Sambuca canadensis, depending upon which botanist you're talking to. And this is growing in exactly the kind of habitat we'd expect an elderberry to grow, because it likes open, sunny, damp, meadowy habitat. And so growing along a river is a comfortable location for elderberry to find itself in. So there's 2 main edible parts on an elderberry. So let's talk about the flowers first. So you see right here the developing flower clusters. So these will be ripe later in June, and it's going to be much, much bigger than this. It will range in diameter from about 4 inches to about 9 inches in diameter. And then these little green flower buds will turn into flowers. And each individual flower is small, but the cluster itself, I say, could be as much as 8 or 9 inches in diameter. And some people gather those flower clusters and they'll fry them in fritter batter. There's another flower, I think, that makes a much tastier fritter than the elderberry flowers, and that's the black locust flower, which the flowers taste like sweet pea pods, and that's the one I would use for fritters instead of the elder flower. And then also people will gather elder flowers and make a drink from them, and there's an alcoholic version and a non-alcoholic version, and that is a possibility. But I personally tend to leave the flowers on the plants, because then the flowers can benefit the pollinators. And remember, if you're picking a flower off the plant, you're not going to get any berries in that spot. So I tend to leave the flowers on the plant and wait for the berries to develop. So in the places where you're seeing the flower buds, this is where the berries will be. So these bloom in June, in a couple weeks, and then the berries will ripen toward the end of the summer. So we're talking usually around Labor Day or a week or so afterwards. And what will happen is the berries will start out green and then turn maroon color and then purple, and then eventually they'll be very close to black in color. And as I said, the cluster will be about this big, and it will hang upside down like that when the berries are fully ripe. From the weight of the fruit pulls the whole cluster upside down. Now I understand that you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of ripe elderberries, but if you dry them first or you cook them first, they're safe to eat as many as you want. And I tend to mix elderberries and apples together. So like elderberry applesauce, elderberry apple pie is more interesting than just plain applesauce and apple pie. And last thing I'll say about elderberries is occasionally you go to these drugstores and apothecaries that will offer products that have elderberry in them, where they claim that it's good against the flu. And I suspect that it is, but you don't have to pay the high prices that they try to charge you in the stores like that. It's basically elderberry juice, so you could make your own. So you harvest the ripe elderberries toward the end of the summer and just simmer the ripe fruit in water to soften it up, and then you could put it through a fine mesh sieve just to hold back the seeds, whatever, and then you would have your juice, which you could drink or take by the teaspoonful, whatever, or add it to other things, or you could freeze it, use it later on, or you could make a tincture from it, so you're adding alcohol to prolong its shelf life and then have it that way. So once again, this is the common elderberry, relatively common plant, but even so, I encourage responsible harvesting of these plants in the wild to make sure that the plants are able to continue to thrive in locations where we're finding them. Because one of the things that native plants do is they often have important ecological roles. They're animals that rely upon them for food or some other important portion of the life cycle. So in the case of elderberries, there is an insect called the elderberry borer beetle that has a very important and intimate association with this plant. So the mature beetles, which are gorgeous by the way, they're iridescent blue and gold in color. So the mature beetles will mate on the elderberry plants. The females will lay the eggs on the elderberry plants. The larvae live inside the elderberry plants, and the larvae don't harm the plants because the insect and the plants are, have co-evolved for many generations, so they're in dynamic equilibrium. They're okay. And so that's why it's important, if you're going to harvest edible parts of elderberries, is to not harvest so much that we begin to lose elderberries in landscape, because that elderberry borer beetle would lose its habitat then. All right, let's see what else we can find. Riverwalk is a great example of a citizen-driven restoration project where they took a rubble-strewn eyesore that was neglected by the town and turned it into a spectacular showpiece by cleaning it up, removing the rubble, removing the invasive species planted with native species. But this has been an excellent showpiece to show off native plants. And this is a place where people can walk and appreciate the plants. And while this isn't really a great place for people to collect and eat plants growing here at Riverwalk, it's a great place to see the plants growing in the natural riparian habitats. And many of these species are very appropriate for people to establish in their own yards. And perhaps they'll get the idea from seeing the plants at Riverwalk that, gee, this plant is nice. It would be nice to have this in my own yard. And then they can establish their own growth there. And of course, once the plant's growing in your own yard, you can nibble on it all you want. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion we've had along Riverwalk with me this morning and learned a few things about these edible plants that we've encountered along the way. And I hope that we'll be able to get together in person sometime and do some more wild edibles here along Riverwalk in Great Barrington